Welcome everyone from Canada, Asia, and around the world to our book talk today. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. I'm so delighted that Professor Yves Tiberghien, a renowned scholar in global governance, has kindly agreed to share key findings and a major update from his extremely topical new book, East Asian COVID-19 Paradox, published by Cambridge University Press. You can find a link to his book in the chat box. Today's event is jointly organized by Prince Takamado Japan Centre for Teaching and Research, Taiwan Studies Program, and the China Institute at the University of Alberta, as well as University of British Columbia. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the history, languages, cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Professor Tiberghien's presentation today will be followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the very bottom of your screen. We have over 280 registrants. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the very end. 2 years in, COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve, so as responses from countries around the world hoping to keep it under control. We will hear from Professor Tiberghien on lessons from China, Japan, and Taiwan on their experience managing its ever-changing challenge. Our aim is to have a research-based discussion highlighting various styles of COVID responses in East Asia and the need for international cooperation. I hope we can all be mindful of the research challenge posed by the constantly changing state of COVID pandemic and respect different perspectives across the virtual floor on this timely topic. First, I'm so honored to introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Yves Tiberghien. Known to many of you, Professor Tiberghien is a highly prolific scholar with many publications. His research and publication focus on comparative political economy and global economic and environmental governance, with an empirical focus on Japan, China, Korea, and Europe. He was made a Knight of National Order of Merit by the French president in 2017 to honor his extraordinary achievements. Dr. Tiberghien is a professor of political science and Konwakai Chair in Japanese research at University of British Columbia. He's also the Director Emeritus of the Institute of Asian Research. He currently serves as a Senior Fellow at the China Institute, a visiting professor at Tokyo University and Taiwan School of Economics, and he was also a former visiting professor at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. I'm also so delighted to welcome two colleagues and friends from the University of Alberta joining us as discussants. They are Dr. Aya Fujiwara and Dr. Ashley Ezere. Dr. Fujiwara is the director of Prince Takamado Japan Centre for Teaching and Research. Her areas of research are ethic and immigration history of Canada, Japanese Canadians, Asian Pacific transnationalism, and Japan-Canada relations. She's the author of 2 books and currently serves on the executive board of the Japan Studies Association of Canada and Canadian Association for Japanese Language Education, among many others. Professor Ashley Ezere is associate professor in the Department of Political Science and also the director of Taiwan Studies at the University of Alberta. His research concerns media and politics in China and Taiwan, environmentalism, peace and security in East Asia, and leadership politics. He championed multiple edited volumes, most recently on Xi Jinping's leadership, on Chinese politics and foreign relations, also developmentalism in East Asia, and another book on Taiwan's democracy. Without further ado, Yves, the virtual floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jia. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. So good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Minasan konnichiwa. Daja hao. Japabwe. Annyeonghaseyo. It's a great pleasure joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hosanich people. And I wish to start by acknowledging the enormous toll, deaths, and pain of so many around the world since December 2019. I also acknowledge the huge mental health impact and the loss of freedom and vision for so many of us, especially young people and all the students that I work with every day. And it's 2 years and a day ago that the lockdown of Wuhan started, January 23rd, 2020. And that was really the moment where when the world grasped how serious the situation was. So I have a couple cartoons to signify how COVID has been so difficult to grapple for policymaking around the world because it keeps reappearing in different variants and through different doors. Recently, Omicron, of course. Omicron has even led the Prime Minister of New Zealand to cancel her wedding. That was announced yesterday. And of course, it affects now the aid that's being brought to Tonga, because since Tonga has had zero COVID. So there are a few puzzles about COVID, and this is what I focus on in the book. Why did a global pandemic with limited mortality trigger the greatest simultaneous lockdown and deepest short-term economic recession since the Spanish flu? Why did East Asian and Oceanian countries on average manage to limit mortality and economic damage better than the rest of the world in 2020 across diverse regimes? Why did East Asia and Oceania show divergent pathways, however, in 2021 and now early 2022 during the Delta and Omicron variants? And what are long-term implications? What can we learn from those cases? So a few key points. COVID-19 has generated a multi-level crisis that was not just a health crisis, but became an economic, societal crisis and a global crisis regarding the global economy and geopolitics. Has generated great stress and fissures in the global order. What was particularly hard was the timing of the crisis and the lack of global coordination compared to other previous crises like H1N1 in 2009, 2008 global financial crisis. This was in the context of the US-China competition or confrontation, China's lack of transparency, and the US reluctance in 2020 with global institutions. At the national level, I argue in the book that two variables explain the strengths of response in East Asia. First, institutional capacity, and second, social cohesion. And I'm going to get into much more details. It's also notable at the regional level that at least in 2020, there was actually an increase in cooperation and regional integration with the signature of RCEP, the biggest free trade agreement in the world at that point. And that was in the context of an increased sense of vulnerability in the region, which led everyone to go for strategic reinforcement in the face of those uncertainties, as well as in the context of informal networks and a convergence of norms. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to say a few words on the global context, but very, very quick, since this is not the focus today, but there is a big section in the book as well on the regional context. I'm going to focus then on the national outcomes with COVID-19, and then the three phases, focusing more on the first one with the causal factors that were critical in various East Asian countries. And then I'll finish with Omicron and some deeper implications. So I want to address my thanks to a team of wonderful research assistants that have worked with me, covering different regions and countries, and the support of various centers at UBC, but also Sciences Po in Paris and Tokyo University. Global governance was missing in action, and that's a key feature here. G7, G20, even NATO, the UN, WTO, all of them failed or underperformed, at least in 2020. There was an improvement in 2021. And the regional development banks, the IMF, the World Bank at the staff level, and even WHO increasingly at the staff level, partially function and filled some of the gap. But this was a context that was particularly difficult to address a global crisis. And this was linked to, on one hand, President Trump's assault on global institutions, and on the second hand, the US confrontation and China's lack of cooperation with many global institutions. And this is in a context where we recognize that pandemic global governance is a vulnerable spot. WHO is underfunded, undermandated, and big members don't follow its guidelines. There's a need for rapid reaction force. And so there's a set of proposals, for example, particularly, I think those ones are useful by Larry Gostin in the US, on the need to beef up essentially the WHO and having a stronger pandemic treaty that would deal with all the zoonotic spillover pandemics that will come, and also how to secure in a stronger way high security labs. So there's a lot of work here that has to be done, but I'll focus now on the domestic side. So the first step is measuring outcomes, and ideally we want to measure them in multiple dimensions. Health outcomes, of course, and I focus more on deaths per million because the cases per million, or the caseload, is highly unreliable because it depends on testing, which is very, very different in many countries, and it varies a lot. So deaths per million lie less, even though there's some underestimation. Also, we can measure vaccination rates and hospital robustness. Second one, we measure economic outcomes. And third, social outcomes, inequality, issue of social acceptance, social tensions. For those indicators, we're very early. We don't have yet all the data. We know that inequality has increased, but we don't have good data separating by countries. And then there's the human outcome in terms of human rights, freedom, etc. And here too, we'll have more and more data over time. One data point that was surprising in 2020 is less so in 2021. And here is present in this Nikkei news graph, is that there was actually correlation between high performance on COVID on the health side and economic outcomes. So there was in 2020 not a trade-off actually between being very effective with the pandemic and active with the economy. So this is a table that's in the book. I separate, 1 year into the pandemic. So this is based on February 6, 2021 data. The deaths per million outcomes across the world. I select a key representative from each regions. And what we find is the high deaths per million, where there was this high mortality, were mostly concentrated in the US, Europe, and South America, plus South Africa. The rest of the world is in the medium and low category. And in the low category, we find all the East Asian countries except for Indonesia and Philippines that are in the medium section. And then we find near the lower part of the medium some Nordic countries. So Nordic countries did very well. And then we find most of African countries in the low category as well. We also find all the Oceanian countries and Pacific Islands in the low category. So this was surprising, right? We didn't expect this. And this is the map as of today, as of yesterday. The darker colors show where COVID has had the biggest impact in terms of mortality. So similar pattern to what I described. We see Indonesia, however, here in Asia, that's striking as, and Malaysia as well. So now there really are three phases, and this is a smaller set of countries. The first column is in a way COVID classic, after 1 year. Second column is the impact of Delta. So I take it at the end of September here. And the final column is as of today or as of yesterday. So we find that similarly, South American, US, Europe, in high categories. Canada is close to world average. But it's interesting in Canada that is heavily driven by Quebec. Quebec is about double the Canadian average. Without Quebec, Canada falls below the world average. And then BC is at almost a quarter of Quebec, almost half of Canada's average. So there's variation by provinces. Then we find, the East Asian cases below. So I'm going to zoom on those that we're concentrating on today. Japan, in the first phase at 50 deaths per million was lower than most of the world, but higher than the rest of East Asia, Korea, Taiwan in particular. In the second phase, the same pattern continue. Korea and Australia, by the way, are very close. They correlate. They're very, very similar in data point. And then in the second phase, Taiwan, which was really the leader in terms of performance, was hit by Delta and had a little bump, which was finally solved by the end of July. When we get to Omicron, we find that the death rate in Taiwan has totally not changed. Similarly in China and Hong Kong. New Zealand almost not changed, but in Korea, surprisingly, and in Australia, there has been an increase in the death rate during Omicron. So different phases of the pandemic hit different countries in a different way. In terms of vaccination rankings, UAE and Portugal, along with Cuba and Chile, are leading, so on the top of the rankings. But then we find Singapore, China, Canada is very high, Japan, Vietnam, and most of East Asia is in a high category now. They were slow. There was a lag of several months for East Asian countries, but they became very high. In terms of economic outcome, so the 2019 column is compared here to 2020, and then what we know so far based on the World Bank Global Economic Prospect or ADB report for 2021, we find that Japan was hit, but not as much as Europe because of heavy fiscal spending. China finished 2020 with a little plus, and 2021 with a bigger plus, but is now decelerating seriously under Omicron. Korea, ended up with -1% essentially in 2020 and +4%, a big jump back in 2021. Taiwan finished with the highest positive growth rate in 2020, which was remarkable, and is still going at 6.2%. So this is remarkable. And quite surprising given that Taiwan has a zero COVID policy. And then Vietnam was doing great in 2020, but decelerated in 2021 under the Delta attack. Indonesia, sort of steady and bouncing back pretty well in 2021. Inequality has risen everywhere within societies, but we don't have good data to separate at the level of countries yet. We also know that extreme poverty has increased everywhere, including in those Asian countries. And we know that there has been a lot of social protests directly linked to COVID-19, although we don't identify too many in East Asia, except in Thailand, to some extent, Malaysia. So now, what explains the outcomes? And there is a puzzle here. Just before the pandemic has it for researchers, Johns Hopkins University, along with the Economist Intelligence Unit, put together the Global Health Security Index that measured how countries were ready for pandemics. US was on top, UK second, Australia third, and in Canada high. Thailand was surprisingly high here, and Korea quite high. But what's interesting is that this index did not correlate with outcomes at the end of the first year by a long shot, right? And so they were expected high performers, Thailand, Korea, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, expected low performers, as well, in South America in particular. But then there were super underperformers, countries that should have had low mortality and ended up having very high mortality. That includes Switzerland, Sweden, France, US, UK, Spain, and then super achievers, and then most of them in East Asia and Africa. Mongolia, Vietnam, China only after January 23rd, Nigeria, Cuba, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and then Philippines, India are in the overperformer category at that point. So to solve that puzzle, the arguments I make in the book is essentially what explains why especially the Taiwan model works so well, but also Korea, Singapore, and others, and Vietnam initially, was number one institutional capacity. And I call this pre-existing targeted centralized governance structures for pandemic response. It's one level below the political regime itself, and they cut across regime types. Second is social cohesion. The government responding in East Asia was able to rely on high levels of social cohesion and social trust. One weak point, however, was much weaker vaccine development, and no mRNA vaccine was developed. The 8 institutional strengths that we identify is really the Taiwan or Korea model here, Singapore. Legal tools for pandemic response were on the book before the pandemic hit. They had been developed over years. And in fact, the pandemic response law was even revised the year before in Taiwan, for example. Very well codified, including the rights of individuals were also codified in this process. Second, rapid mobilization of centralized government pandemic headquarters. And here too, we find Taiwan, Korea at the forehead along Singapore, followed by Vietnam. Japan was only later. Third, reliance on health scientists and empowered CDC with no politicization, very strong across the region. Fourth, rapid border response with quarantine isolation and the right staffing. Fifth, rapid provision of tests and PPEs. Again, Taiwan leading the pack here. Next, contact tracing apps with, of course, this is controversial in terms of privacy protection, but there was high codification of privacy protection in Taiwan and to some extent Singapore, medium in Korea, and of course low in China or Vietnam, not widely used in Japan. Seventh, rapid generalized mask wearing across the region. And finally, clear, precise, empowering, respectful, effective communication that was very well organized at the top. So this is what we find for the model. In terms of if you look at the second column here on the centralized headquarters or task force, we find that, for example, Korea had it up and running on the 22nd, Mongolia 19th, Taiwan the 20th. Korea is also 22nd, Thailand is later in March, Vietnam on January 30th. So this is a key feature that differentiates East Asian cases from Europe and North America. So something else about China, clearly there are 3 phases in the response. The first phase is the one that's very controversial. It's a phase of delay and political suppression. December remains a point of debate among scholars because there was a lot of unknown. But from December 29, everything is known essentially, and the scientists have identified the problem. And until January 20, there is essentially political suppression of the medical capacity that was put in place in response to SARS. And the context was the People's Congress of the Wuhan government and of the Hubei province, which apparently motivated the local governments to, to suppress. Only after January 20, we have a massive mobilization. And it's signified by Zhong Nanshan's, the Dr. Zhong Nanshan's briefing on January 20, and then the lockdown of January 23rd in Wuhan. And after that, they managed to eradicate COVID. They developed massive contact tracing, vaccine development, etc., and they reopened the economy and society after April. It's a massive, massive action with limitation on freedoms, but it works in terms of suppressing COVID. And then from the fall 2021, we enter a phase maybe that we could call political entrenchment of zero COVID and border closure, but in the face of ever-growing economic, social, and individual costs. And so there's a question of exit options here. Japan is a bit different from what I described, because it had only 2 of the 8 East Asian institutional features in the initial phase: mask wearing and good communication. The laws allowing only prefectural level emergencies were only passed in March. There was no legal lockdown capacity in Japan. And there was concern about the Olympics that hampered the political response and some political infighting as well, but strong focus on individual privacy. However, there was an innovative response in terms of retrospective contact tracing, an interesting innovation, and the 3C guidelines that were clearly communicating to the public. And Japan was successful, essentially, with slightly less good numbers than Korea or Taiwan, but due to two assets: strong social cohesion and social response to guidelines. And second, very effective protection of long-term care senior homes by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, something we can learn a lot from in Canada or the US. In terms of social trust, it's striking that East Asian cases and Nordic countries come on top of many surveys on trust toward your neighbors or horizontal trust in general within society. And so we find, find most of the countries here. In terms of vertical trust toward the government, we find, well, the China data, we don't know how reliable that is, but maybe to some extent Vietnam. But then again, we find a lot of East Asian countries right up here in the top. In terms of trust, response to government policy, was it effective? We find extremely strong positives in Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, and Taiwan, and to some extent Korea, but not so in Japan. So the public was not very happy with this very decentralized response to some extent. Social divisions have been seen to not increase in most of East Asia, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, but they have increased in Japan and South Korea. So there's a contrast. And of course, in Europe and North America. Should there have been more government restrictions? We find Japan on the very top of that survey that was done in June 2021. So then Delta hit, and Delta in a way played a bit of havoc with the model. And countries started doing different things. So China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Taiwan, to some extent Vietnam, tried to stick with zero COVID-19 with their variations, right, I have described. Then the second group, South Korea, Singapore, and Australia, decided to give up on zero COVID and move to aggressive containment, strategic adaptation, high vaccination, and targeted opening, or living with COVID, which we now can test under Omicron. Japan continued its third approach, which is low government controls and limited contact tracing and lots of voluntary social restrictions to 3C. And then in East Asia, a few countries that were doing well in 2020, Southeast Asia, sorry, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Mongolia, got overwhelmed by Delta at a time where there was too much economic social duress. Indonesia and Philippines held steady, but with lower numbers than the Northeast Asian cases. Taiwan had struggled, procuring vaccines due to its position and in a way the effort by China to prevent direct purchase. Taiwan did develop its own vaccine, and it was that delayed a little bit the rollout. By now, there's a very high vaccination success. And what's interesting is, if we get the data right now, 40% came from AstraZeneca, including donations from Japan, 24% through the US on Moderna, 5% is the Taiwan vaccine, and 34% from Pfizer, which went through Shanghai. So there's a very diverse profile of the vaccine rollout here. Omicron has led to divergent effects and outcomes. Korea, Australia, and Singapore, because of the living with COVID, have seen significant increase in deaths and cases. Taiwan and New Zealand continue closure and zero COVID with some manageable costs so far. Taiwan has seemed to be immune from in terms of economic impact. So very, very interesting case. In Japan, there's a bit of an Omicron paradox with a more robust response under Kishida-san to this wave than to previous ones, and the closure of the border to all but Japanese. There's high public support for that very intense response and flat deaths mostly. And China continues the hard enforcement, but we see increasingly extreme measures with sudden shutdown and lockdown, and a fragmentation of country with local governments taking the lead in various very ad hoc sudden measures. We don't see an exit strategy in sight. So the outcomes for Omicron, mostly what I showed, but in terms of new cases, what you can find is Australia has seen a big explosion that's similar to Europe. France is leading with an enormous number of new cases per million. Canada, by the way, is down to 500, 10% of France at this point. And then Japan has now seen quite a lot of cases, just like Singapore. So this is where the Omicron wave is hitting. And then there is this, to finish here on China, most countries are still in an opening mood, except Vietnam, China, and New Zealand at this point that are digging down with an effort to do zero COVID. The Eurasia Institute in its Global Risks 2022 report put the zero COVID strategy of China as the #1 global risks because the costs are getting very, very high. And we do see the very harsh nature of the Xi'an lockdown in December. And we find increasingly suspension of major flights at the last minute, fragmentation of measures, and really the lack of an exit option. So there's a lot of concern here where those things will go. So in conclusion, we have seen large variation of outcomes. Asian countries managed to contain the health impact better than most countries and beyond the ex-ante health system capacity, based on their strong coordination institutions and social cohesion. But they were slow to develop vaccine, and they were hit hard by Delta and now Omicron. We have seen inequality and social anger rising in Korea and Japan. Taiwan maintains zero COVID, but with some flexible management and no economic damage so far. There are deeper aspects of COVID at the individual and national level, but growing anger and the difficulty for democracies and for the global level. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Looks like my video is locked. Hello, everyone. This is Ashley Essery. I think I'll have my video in a second. It's my job to moderate this portion of the event. And our plan for today is to go to each of the directors of these centers and programs, and we'll get a comment and a question from each one of them, and we'll reserve the remainder of the time for questions from the audience. So if you are a member of the audience, you can ready those questions and put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I'll start with Dr. Fujiwara, who will comment presumably on the Japan portion of the presentation and raise a question. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ashley, and thank you very much for your presentation, Yves. And it is a very interesting and ambitious book, taking COVID-19 as the central topic at the same time as incorporating pre-existing geopolitics, economy, and regional culture. And probably you've written this book, for such a short period of time, so congratulations. So in general, you provided readers with some very positive natures of East Asia in its response to the pandemic. But as you pointed out, Japan is an outlier in this region. And domestically, the lack of lockdown, the Go To Travel campaign, and the Olympics, and many other policies that you mentioned in this book were often criticized by people of Japan. And Japan being described as a resilient nation by the president of the IOC was not digested very well either. So economic disparities, concerns of inflation as opposed to the flattened average economy, and the inefficient administration due to the delayed digitalization and the interruption of expanding tourism projected with the Olympics and cool Japan's strategies causes frustration among the people. But it seems like your argument is, if we look at a broader picture, Japan was doing well in taking a leading role in some areas of domestic policies and international collaboration work and response. So taking this, given these contrasting views, my question is, when and how will the people in Japan feel the impact of the positive leadership in this regional economy? and how effective are Japan's external policies to boost people's trust in the government, especially with China and the United States? This is my question.
This is a tough question. Thank you, Ayas, and great for your kind comments. Yeah, so there's often an interesting paradox between the actions that Japan takes as evaluated in international rankings or by outsiders and public opinion in Japan, right? So there is, for example, there's a similar debate when it comes to inequality. Japanese people react very strongly to the rising inequality ever since the Koizumi reform. And that's why the 2009 election was fought on the Kaksa Mondai, right? Yeah. And yet in international standards, the inequality in Japan rose only a little bit. And now it's slightly decreased. And yet again, with the new form of capitalism approached by Prime Minister Kishida, there is a focus on inequality. And the people do react immensely to that. And it puzzles, say, Americans who's like, look, your inequality is not the main issue, it's your competitiveness, it's your innovation. But when it comes to COVID, it is true that the public has been very dissatisfied, right? Despite the numbers that I show. And there has been a very high correlation in Japan, which is really unique, between the COVID numbers, the case numbers, and popularity of the prime minister and support rate. And so Prime Minister Suga failed and had to resign after 1 year and couldn't compete in the LDP race because of the bad COVID numbers, which peaked actually in August, just the wrong time for him. So there's a very, very high sensitivity. So the public indeed will not judge very highly, for example, the role that Japan has played with the ADB or with JICA in East Asia and actually helping the rest of Southeast Asia, etc., or doesn't react very strongly to the very delicate diplomacy that Japan has been engaged in strengthening its security position with the US, with the Quad on one hand, free and open Indo-Pacific, on the other hand, maintaining working level economic relations with China to avoid having its economy fall apart. That's not where they focus. Right now, there's an issue of the actual COVID, and then there's the issue of trust of the people toward the government. And essentially, the public was frustrated that too much of the burden of fighting COVID was put on society rather than the government. So much was delegated to efforts by the public. They did the effort, but they resented it. They felt that the government could have done better in having more hospital beds, in having more empowerment of nurses who have very little power in hospitals, or in closing the borders faster, or there's a whole bunch of things that they felt the government should have done. And they also resent the Olympic Games, right, in the midst of this crisis. So Kishida-san seemed to be more attuned with public opinion, and he's trying to react, and that's why he's reacting so strongly to Omicron.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go now to Interim Director of the China Institute, Jiao Wang, for a comment and a question.
Well, thank you, Yves, for such a fascinating presentation, and also thank you for writing this very comprehensive and also insightful book. I encourage our audience member to continue to follow your study as you look further into this topic. What really strikes me through your presentation, but also your book, is despite various different health capacities within different states in East Asia, most East Asian countries are doing fairly well in managing COVID and also keeping the mortality rate down. So of course, you highlighted quite a few reasons and different models. But in your book, you also mentioned the sort of the collective, or maybe putting a premium on collective goods by many members of this East Asian society, and also maybe a higher level of trust in government and in the authorities that might have contributed to this level of response. But then, of course, there are also a lot of other ways these societies mobilized quickly to respond to this crisis. when we look at Western countries, of course, they're coming from a different place and they may not have quite the same social values or putting such a high premium on collective goods. But are there some lessons Western societies perhaps could learn from the management of the good and the bad from the East Asian countries and how they manage this crisis? And also, are there perhaps, through the experience of East Asia, there are actually regional collaborations and cooperation that you think it's a good example for perhaps a successful model going into the future? Is there something on that front you could comment on, perhaps for an audience in the Western countries, but also a global audience to look at in the future how we can perhaps better work together despite our differences?
Thank you, Jia. You covered several questions here. That's very, very rich. So I'll start with a couple caveats and then a couple points. The caveats is first, we are still in the middle of all this COVID thing, right? And just like, in WHO, WEF, and everyone was praising the Vietnam model at the end of 2020, and then, the Vietnam model faced enormous duress in 2021. So there can be reversals, and the assessment is not complete, right? Because what's difficult for a lot, as shown by Vietnam, which was early in this process, the exit strategy from zero COVID is very difficult, and they can be a sudden major crisis. So we have to see where things go, for example, for in the case of China. So that's the first caveat. The second is within the West, there was actually great variation. And so, for example, the Nordic countries have performance that's quite similar to the East Asian cases in the end. And then there's Australia and New Zealand, which behave like East Asian countries. So we have to, and then within Canada, we have huge variation among provinces with a 1-to-4 ratio almost between BC and Quebec, and not even talking of the maritime provinces or the northern provinces. So those are the caveats. Now, in terms of trust, I want to emphasize that the findings I found is the vertical trust toward government doesn't work across the board. For example, it didn't work well for Korea and Japan because the numbers in World Value Service, for example, are always low for Korea and Japan. But it could be an issue of translation. That is, if you ask an average Japanese, do you trust the government? Since the mid-90s, they always say no. But the no is not the same as a no from European, for example. So there's an issue of culture here. But what we do find is that the horizontal trust, that is the trust within society, trust of neighbors, doing things for the neighbor or for someone else in the society, that's what's still very strong across the region. And that became an asset. It's also strong in Nordic countries, also strong in Australia and New Zealand, interestingly, and the Pacific countries, all the Pacific islands. In terms of learning, we have, of course, within the confines of what's acceptable to different cultures, right? Each cultures have evolved those things over centuries. And, we live in a culture where we prize freedom above all, right? And this is who we are. But within those confines, there's a few interesting things that we can still learn. One is actually from Japan, and it's the management of nursing homes for elderly senior citizens. They were extremely efficient in closing them down early, like in January, with firewalls, and to have very limited deaths there. And this is, however, where 80% of the deaths happen in Canada. In some extent, in the US is also very high. So we have really to improve the management of senior homes. So that's something that we can directly learn. Something else that we can learn is the coordination mechanism, so the centralized headquarters. But ironically, this was initially something that was taught by the CDC of the US, right? So the US did pioneer that method based on its own understanding, and they're very good during Ebola. But the previous US administration had undone most of those institutional things. So those institutional legacies were present in places like Vietnam, as taught by the CDC of the US, but had been dismantled in the US. So those things we relearn, and those are good institutional tools. And then we can learn in terms of communication, strategies, and then the management of masks and PPEs and like. So there's a bunch of practical things to learn. In terms of cooperation, clearly, there's a lot more that can be done, and it can be done in regional cooperation or across small groups or in bigger groups. So certain tasks like the supply chains of PPEs may be within like-minded groups to have some safety there. Vaccines, there has to be multi-level. Some sharing of knowledge is happening, for example, between the US and Vietnam right now, also with Taiwan. But clearly there has to be, hopefully, a coming together of the whole international community toward new international health guideline and the reform of WHO. And hopefully we'll see an acceptance by China toward that, and also from the US and from everyone. That is a sort of common good that is required. It'll be very hard to fight global pandemics of the future if we don't get there.
Thank you very much, Yves. Over to you, Ashley.
Oh, thank you, Jia. And it's my turn to make a comment and ask a question from the perspective of the Director of Taiwan Studies. But first, I remain in awe of your ability to master so much empirical information so quickly, and you did all of this in the middle of the pandemic. Congratulations on this exciting study. As your book notes, and as your presentation today demonstrates, Taiwan has handled the COVID-19 pandemic really well. And you write that from spring 2020, COVID-19 was essentially defeated. With the exception of a few sporadic cases, people were able to live a normal life. There have been some infections associated with Omicron, and new restrictions in social interaction are in place in Taiwan, but these are relatively minor compared to some restrictions we've seen around the world. And in Taiwan, as the data that you've shown indicates, mortality rates per million are among the lowest in Asia and in the world. So your case study on Taiwan is really helpful for illuminating some main ingredients of Taiwan's success. And these included the stockpiling of PPE, producing it very quickly, rapid border closures, the early activation of a Center for Disease Control command center that provided frequent updates, and then the relatively gentle quarantines for arrivals that in Taiwan, it lasted about 14 days apiece, and really high rates of mask wearing. And in your section on Taiwan, you include a quote by the former Taiwanese Vice President Chen Jianren on the benefits of high levels of public trust. And this is something that Aya and Jia touched on in their questions. And the former VP Chen Jianren says, where you see more trust, you have more cooperation. And this raises the chance of successes, presumably for a range of public health measures. So my question to you is, what are some of the lessons you see from Taiwan or elsewhere in East Asia for maintaining high levels of public trust in government during the pandemic? And I ask because I was traveling along the Yellowhead Highway in Alberta yesterday and saw a lot of people protesting federal government's policies toward truckers in particular. But in Canada, sort of broadly speaking, but particularly in Alberta, there seems to be a decline in public trust in the federal government's public health measures. So I'm wondering, again, a la Jia's question, are there lessons here that can be learned about what Taiwan or what these other East Asian states did to maintain high levels of public trust during a time that is very difficult to do this?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. It's always a pleasure working together. Thank you for your great comments and question. So there's two parts of the answer. The first part is a lot of the first the social trust, but even the public trust in Taiwan predates this crisis, right? So in a way, trust is hard to build in a one-time go. It's built over a long time, both the horizontal and vertical trust. And so that's the first point, and we can go how it was built. But actually, interestingly, the trust toward medical innovation in Taiwan goes back a long time, and even in the Japanese time, this is where there was a lot of investment very early on. But a small anecdote is many Taiwanese often want to become doctors. So there's very, very high respect for the medical profession. And the fact that the vice president is an epidemiologist, right? That's also remarkable. There are very few places in the world where the top person in the government is an epidemiologist. So that's the preconditions. But next is, what can we learn? So there's a bunch of things. So number one was extreme preparation. So everything was ready before the pandemic hit. The legal tools that were put in place, very sophisticated. The empowerment of the command headquarters, even the stipulation of how you would do contact tracing, because they did launch apps and very thorough contact tracing, which is a big part of the success. But it was all legalized and passed ahead of time with the right protection of privacy. Very few places have done this so thoroughly ahead of time. So great preparation, some of it related to SARS. After SARS, they learned the lesson. Taiwan has always had to deal with public health issues. It goes back all the way to the Qing dynasty. There were always issues of disease and the like. So maybe there is a long pathway here. The second thing is they reacted very fast in triggering the command headquarters. January 20, right? And what's stunning is, we have Taiwan, we have Korea, we have Vietnam, Singapore triggering all the maximum alerts January 20, and the rest of the world did not follow suit. So there's so much to learn here. When it comes to public health, we always better watch the Taiwanese. They're very professional, they know what they're doing. There's a lot to learn and cooperate. A small third point, which was interesting, is that the Taiwanese health professionals did get good info and intel from Wuhan early on because they had good cooperation between hospitals, and they had been training many Chinese doctors, including from Wuhan. So on January 13 or January 12, a delegation was invited by Wuhan from Taiwan, medical doctors, to inspect the Wuhan situation, along with some Hong Kong doctors. And they got the info that there was human-to-human transmission. They got it on January 13. They flew right back, and right away they informed CDC, and that's how they triggered everything on January 20. And so there's a lot of lesson here. Having working relationships among professionals and doctors was crucial in this case, in getting the info that Taiwan needed to act. Then they also had very good organization of communication, very well done, without politicization or anything, and in part because the government was very trustworthy about it. They tried to take the measures that were effective without excess and with guarantees on privacy and individual freedom. And then finally, there was a lot of compassion. That's the Taiwanese touch, right? There's hospitality, there's care, there's compassion. And so when a Taiwanese would come back from abroad, like Taiwanese students from UBC, they would have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Very effective. And by the way, they were so organized that you couldn't take an average taxi or bus, like as we do in Vancouver. You would have to be in a COVID protected car that's that the government approves of to your point of quarantine. You can't go anywhere else. But they were paid during the quarantine. They got something like $1,000 Canadian for 2 weeks for citizens, right? And they receive a package from the police with a health kit and some food and ramen noodles and the like. That's so smart, right? That's this human touch of doing things in a caring way that shows, look, I'm sorry, I have to quarantine you, and you're going to have to report every day to the police, right? They had to report to the police with SMS and the like, and to have to do tests. Sorry, I have to do this to you, but here, we care for you. Here is a package for you. So that's something, all this we can learn from, I think. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks so much. We just have a little bit of time for questions for the audience, and we have a few. Probably we won't be able to get to all of them. Here's one question. It is, China has been criticized for not being transparent enough during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic by the United States and other Western nations. Is it possible or even likely that they deliberately underreport the impact of COVID-19 on their domestic market to position themselves in a stronger position relative to the rest of the world, i.e. China's longer-term vision to be a dominant superpower. I'll give you that one first and another one or two if there's time.
So first thing to say, there's a lot we don't know about what happened in China from November all the way to January 2019 to January 2020. And so, I'm speaking without full knowledge here. Nobody has the full info what happened. But based on, the study of governance and bureaucratic politics, there are some simpler explanations, right, to explain what happened. And if we can also compare the outcomes to what happened in SARS. So compared to SARS, there is the good and the bad, right? The bad is there was a delay in information of WHO. There's delay by a few days when it's supposed to be 24 hours initially. And there was suppression of doctors that had all the information and use of police and repression and all this. And then there was delay of any effective action for 3 weeks. So all this is the bad side that normally China has learned to not do after SARS. On the good side, they did code the virus, rather quickly and put it on the web on January 10. And the fact that this DNA sequence was on the web allowed everybody else, like Taiwan-Korea and everybody else, to do tests very quickly and to move very, very fast. So that has been praised by scientists around the world. And then in terms of what caused this outcome, there's a basic explanation, which is local governments especially under Xi Jinping are terrified of doing anything wrong and sharing bad news, especially in January when they have to do their People's Congress before Chinese New Year. And so there's a basic explanation that the local government in Wuhan clearly wanted to suppress all this. And they had their party Congress, their People's Congress just at the same time. So that's, baseline explanation. Whether there was something more strategic or more sinister happening at the center, there's no way to know now, but you can explain the outcome even without that. And then what we find is in that first phase, essentially the political and repressive part of the system took over the health professionals. And then January 20, with the return of Zhong Nanshan, the hero of SARS, then the health professionals were brought back on the floor, and then they launched this massive bureaucratic health response. So this is, a more basic domestic politics kind of story, which fits within the pattern of what of scholars of Chinese bureaucracy would find. Okay. There could be more than that, but I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, maybe there's time for one last question here. And it pertains to China as well. How has COVID-19 affected Canada's relationship with China? What is the future of that relationship? Okay, so very large second question.
Well, of course, COVID has had a very bad impact on the relationship, right? And at the elite level, at the diplomatic level and all this, it's prevented any diplomacy. At the grassroots level, it also prevents any people contact. China is shut down entirely. Nobody has access. So the people-to-people relationship or business don't happen either. Families are interrupted and all this. But it's also important to note that this happened in the context of the two Michaels being detained, right? And in the context of all the information on Xinjiang repression and the Hong Kong thing. So is the convergence of all those crises and issues that are very dear to Canadians, the two Michaels, Xinjiang repression, the Hong Kong repression, and the tension between US and China and the escalation of warfare diplomacy, all this happened at the same time, while there is no more people-to-people relationship. So, as a result, in the context of COVID and all this, the public surveys in Canada of feelings toward China plummeted. And the relationships at the top have been very, very difficult. And it's also part of the larger context of a brewing, Cold War between the West, and China. So COVID will be seen as that historical moment. Now, it's in terms of global pandemic governance, in terms of managing global economy, in terms of avoiding, war, destruction of global order. there has to be some kind of ways of diplomacy. But COVID made things very difficult, there's no question.
Great, thank you. With that, I'll pass the baton to you, Aya, to wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Wonderful presentation, Professor Tiberghien. And congratulations again for your wonderful book. And as we continue to face many global challenges in addition to the pandemic, climate change, poverty, security, and so on, I hope to see more innovative thoughts, rigorous actions, and collaboration coming out of this region. So on behalf of the China Institute, Taiwan Studies Program, and Prince Takamado Japan Centre for Teaching and Research at University of Alberta, I thank everybody for your participation and support, and have a very good afternoon.